of the greatest questions in history, in my opinion, is what causes a revolution? There's no good answer as to what are exactly the necessary requirements for a revolution. If history were an exact science, we might be able to do that. Since it is not, we can do our best to explore the context in which a revolution occurred and pay careful attention to the political premises of the society on the eve of its revolution. Today, we will see how, for Americans, as was the case with many other revolutions, the revolution stemmed from a political and social compact that, according to them, had been breached. Furthermore, in any exploration of history, we must pay careful attention to change over time. Many revolutionary events did not start out with the intent of revolution, but radicalized with time. The American Revolution was such a case. As we saw, Americans during the several decades leading up to the 1760s developed resentment towards the British Army and British authorities. Nonetheless, immediately after the 7 Years' War, in 1763, most Americans celebrated the British victory. It was their victory, after all, and celebrated their identity as British subjects of the King. They viewed the British Constitution as the best system of government the world had ever seen, and themselves as the freest people history had ever known. So how, a mere 13 years later, did they end up declaring independence and fighting a war against the strongest nation in the entire world? To answer this question, we need to, of course, understand the basics of what happened, what the British did, how the colonials responded, and then what the British did responding to that, and so on. And the majority of this lecture is going to be focused on that narrative. However, in addition to understanding this basic chain of events, we need to understand why colonial people interpreted British actions the way they did. In other words, we need to get inside their heads and see why incidents that, from many people's perspectives, both then and now, didn't seem like such a huge deal, ended up convincing many people in America that Britain was out to squash their liberty and turn them into slaves. Because in many ways, the fact that they came to this conclusion was deeply strange. So we'll be talking somewhat about that as well today, and we'll especially dive into it in the next lecture. But the British, at least for sure, thought it was strange. And that was why Parliament did not hesitate after the 7 Years' War to start placing taxes on goods in the colonies. As we discussed last time, from the point of view back at home in England, a long and costly war had been fought to protect those colonies and expand the territory colonists could now settle in. And so it only seemed proper that colonists contribute to paying off the debt that the war had created. Well, the first attempt at doing this was a sugar tax in 1764. The sugar tax clamped down on enforcing taxes which had long existed to benefit the sugar trade of the British West Indies. The policy had existed for 30 years but had been ignored by lenient juries and a common practice of smuggling. But now, juries were denied to those caught smuggling. Instead, they went to vice admiralty courts, which were basically military courts, and the taxes were actually enforced. That's what the sugar tax was intended to do, was actually enforce these taxes that had been in place. This threatened the rum business in the colonies, but more fundamentally, it worried those who had made a living depending on a lax enforcement of various rules and restrictions governing commerce. What could they tax and enforce next? So the thought went. Although there was opposition, however, it was not considerable. Just some murmurings at this point about what this might imply. But then, in the late spring of 1765, the colonists received news that a new tax had been passed by Parliament, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required putting a tax on many crucial paper transactions in the colonies, such as the papers granting licenses, for example, the license to become a lawyer, or your diploma, right, if you got a degree. and also the paper to print newspapers on. In order to conduct any of these transactions, you had to buy paper stamped from London that confirmed that it came from the official supply of taxed paper, hence the Stamp Act. Many of these taxes were quite high and created a huge amount of concern over whether people would be able to pay them. Some newspapers, for example, were not sure if they could stay in business if they had to buy the taxed papers. But to the colonists, the Stamp Act represented a threat to their liberty in more than just an immediate or financial sense. For if allowed to be accepted as a precedent, many believed that the British Parliament would increasingly become used to abusing the colonies, soaking them for revenue whenever they liked and disregarding their rights of English self-government. As one patriot put it, "Nothing is wanted at home but a precedent, the force of which shall be established by the tacit submission of the colonies. If the Parliament succeeds in this attempt, other statutes will impose other duties, and thus the Parliament will levy upon us such sums of money as they choose to take, without any other limitation than their pleasure." Quick note, I am trying to read these 18th century quotes according to their italicized and capitalized emphasis. A fun thing about writing in this time period is there was not all of these strict rules about when you could capitalize and when you could italicize, and oftentimes it was there to help people read this out loud to a crowd and know how and when to emphasize, because a lot of people couldn't read, so one of the people who was literate would read it to a crowd, and this would sort of give them rhetorical cues. So next time someone condescendingly says to you that you should be able to make an argument without all caps, just remind them that it was common practice of everybody once upon a time, right? To make their point through such techniques. All right, so what to do about this situation? Well, a short-term solution, at least, was stumbled upon in Boston in August of 1765. One morning, an effigy, which means a dummy that's made up to look like a particular person, an effigy of the stamp collector, the person responsible for enforcing the tax in Massachusetts, a man named Andrew Oliver, an effigy of him appeared hanging on a designated Liberty Tree in Boston's South End. A crowd gathered later in the evening and paraded around with the effigy, attacked a building being built that was rumored to be the new stamp office for the city, burned the effigy of Oliver, and then showed up at his house and attacked it. Not surprisingly, Oliver then wrote to the Treasury in Britain to be asked to be excused from collecting the tax, and he told everyone that he did so they would leave him alone. So basically, it is clear that he capitulated out of being intimidated and terrorized, emotionally at least, by the local crowd that opposed the Stamp Act. It was a tactic that worked to stop the immediate collection of the tax, and other crowds in the colonies soon adopted the same strategy. And in turning to crowd action, English people turned to the most effective tactic that they knew of. British elites, not surprisingly, referred to the crowd as the mob, but of course a mob is a hard thing to define any other way than simply being a crowd which is doing something that you disapprove of. If you could come up with another definition that doesn't ultimately hinge on your evaluation of what said crowd is doing, let me know, because I've never come up with one. And actually, the crowds or mobs of colonial America were something of a complex creature that could behave in various ways depending on who made up the crowd and what was going on at a particular moment. Especially in the colonial port towns of America, the crowd consisted of a diverse array of people, both high and low. Usually, the crowd had leaders that were drawn from the more well-to-do or long-established leaders of such organizations as fire companies. For example, Benjamin Franklin founded Philadelphia's first fire company, and often fire companies were the projects of elite gentlemen displaying their service to a community. So often, the crowd was guided with some sort of leadership from certain authority figures or groups within the community. Now, in port towns, though, sailors made up a large proportion of the people participating in crowd action, and they were usually central to the course the crowd took. They were also a little bit harder to control. Maybe it's a bit of that pirate culture seeping in there. Sailors, or tars, as they were commonly referred to, for instance, probably brought to America the custom of tarring and feathering that became a symbol of the American resistance. So, tarring and feathering, which was pouring hot tar on a person and then covering them in feathers to humiliate them and make it clear what the community thought of whatever they did, is a pretty clear way, right, of expressing disapproval of an individual. And it clearly placed a stigma in a very real and physical sense upon the person. It could also be very painful and, of course, was extremely humiliating. Elites expressed varying levels of comfort with practices like this, and oftentimes they were the result of the mob deciding on its own what needed to be done. In the miniseries film, John Adams, if you've ever seen it, stars Paul Giamatti, for example, there is a scene which depicts a tarring and feathering, not as a quaint or a humorous thing to do, which is how it's usually remembered, but a very violent and cruel thing to do to someone. Nonetheless, it was a very effective way for politics to be communicated in the street, if you will. It made very clear to the surrounding communities what behaviors would be tolerated. Now, in most port towns, Americans quickly organized into groups that called themselves Sons of Liberty, that sought to tap the energy of the crowd and harness it for a better guided effort. The first groups that called themselves the Sons of Liberty and started gaining traction were formed in the first few months of 1765, but then started to become very popular in February of 1766. Usually, the Sons of Liberty were groups composed of a diverse array of people, but usually led by more well-to-do and respected people. In Boston, for instance, the most famous and influential person in the Sons of Liberty was Samuel Adams, a well-connected man from the Boston elite who cultivated ties with different influential anti-tax activists. Moreover, in the next few years, the Sons of Liberty emerged in many of the towns of colonial America, and as they did so, they communicated with one another on a regular basis, creating a network of organizations that tied a national elite interested in pushing back against British policy with a large and sometimes unpredictable group of men of middling or working class origin. Because although most Sons of Liberties were headed by elite gentlemen, and therefore crowd actions often occurred either in a well-controlled way that was designed by the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, at other times they could happen more spontaneously. So the problem for the leaders was that once a crowd got together, it was hard to control it, especially if this happened in an unplanned way, a spontaneous way. Indeed, upon many occasions, the leaders of the Sons of Liberty tried to prevent a crowd action that they thought was too provocative, and they had varying degrees of success. One case in which they didn't, for example, was in August of 1765, when an angry crowd in Boston surrounded the house of the Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who they suspected, correctly, of being supportive of the Stamp Act. The crowd managed to get inside of Hutchinson's large and well-decorated house and destroyed it and looted it. This kind of property destruction was not, of course, the type of behavior that the more elite leaders of the opposition to the Stamp Act wanted to see. Nonetheless, every now and then, the moderating effects of leading gentlemen persuading crowds to express their anger in some other way failed to win the day, and popular unrest would spill over into overt destruction. However, despite the potential of violence, it is very telling that few people were mortally injured during these riots. This shows a certain system of regulation of the crowd, either through leadership or by limits that the crowd imposed on itself. Even when they did these things like destroy houses, they usually didn't murder anybody. Most of the violence was directed at property, the destruction of people's houses, products, stores, and so on. Even tarring and feathering did not inflict mortal wounds, as the pine tar that was used was not hot enough to kill anyone. Now we must remember that at this point, American colonists did not call into question British authority altogether. Indeed, they couched their argument in terms of their English rights as Englishmen, and thought that on this basis, their resistance was legitimate. In other words, it's not that the English were bad at this point. This is not how they are thinking, because after all, they are Englishmen. It was rather that they were being very bad Englishmen, i.e. violating what it meant to respect English tradition. Moreover, at this point, the Sons of Liberty and other like-minded groups only sought to prevent the Stamp Act from setting a precedent that they did not agree with. And at first, it seemed as if the American resistance succeeded, as the British repealed the Stamp Act early in 1766. So another point to make here is that despite the ambiguous nature, right, of these protests, they also created a pressure that was very effective. Real quick here, the image you see is from this event with Oliver, and it is a notice that the Sons of Liberty put in the newspaper. Actually, I think it was a flyer that went around that was telling people this is where we're going to meet, right? And this is what we're going to do, more or less. All right. So the Stamp Act is repealed. However, within a year, news arrived of a new series of taxes on various imports. Like the previous taxes, the Townshend Acts were intended to raise revenue, but this time most of it was intended to go to paying the salaries of various royal officials in the colonies. The reason this was threatening to the colonists was because up till then, the colonial assemblies and colonial legislatures, where these officials worked, were responsible for paying the official salary, which meant if these officials did things that angered the citizens of the colonies they worked for, they could be punished by having their salaries withheld. In this sense, they were beholden to the colonial government, so it was the power of the purse. With the Townshend Act, however, this was no longer the case, and royal officials could be free to implement the laws of Great Britain without fear of reprisal from colonials. And this, moreover, was exactly the effect that the author of the Acts, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I can never pronounce it, Charles Townshend, for which the Acts are named, this is exactly what he intended, to free up the officials appointed, right, by the crown in the colonies to act more independently of the colonial legislatures and assemblies. Now, as you can imagine, this did not sit well with the colonists, and the concern over taxes continued to escalate, and those opposing the taxes increasingly framed the question not merely as one of whether or not colonial businesses were to be unfairly targeted by taxes, but whether taxes themselves would be used as tools to deny the colonists of their rights as Englishmen. Now, another tool colonists developed to resist the acts of the Parliament of Britain was the boycott. A few weeks ago we talked about how, last week we talked about how consumer culture was growing in the English colonies during this time period, tying people together in a shared identity and shared culture. Well, ironically, this sense of commonality created by consumption was a concept that could also be put to use against the British. For when people decided to stop buying British goods whenever possible, they were making a statement about their political identity and their solidarity, right? Who they viewed themselves as in a community with. After all, if colonists had learned to look at themselves as one people through what they bought, they could also therefore learn to look at themselves as one people through what they refused to buy. Consuming, in other words, was a politically significant and meaningful activity. So people choosing to stop consuming together was a powerful political statement and a way for people to build a sense of shared political commitment. Moreover, the boycotts were one way for women to participate in resistance. Usually barred from the more unruly crowd actions, women were encouraged, on the other hand, to contribute to colonial resistance by creating homemade clothing, known as homespun, and other goods. And surely enough, many colonial women responded to this call enthusiastically and were even happy to engage in some crowd action of their own. As a merchant known to be selling goods taxed by the British could very well find his shop surrounded by angry patriot women demanding he stop selling the unpatriotic products. A quick note on terminology here. Throughout the rest of the course in this lecture, when I say the word patriot, what I mean is somebody who is a proponent of this cause to push back against the policy of Britain, and then, once independence is declared, to support the independence movement. During the controversy over the Tension Acts, another step of escalation occurred that, although minor at the time, would wind up vastly increasing the distrust between the colonists and Parliament. The administration in Britain, upon hearing about the rebellion against the Acts, sent 4,000 British troops to Boston to reassert the authority of Parliament there. This began a pattern of an increasing military presence in Boston. The presence of the troops made for tense conditions in Boston, conditions that occasionally broke out in violence. One such incident, the event known in the colonies as the Boston Massacre, occurred when somehow British troops opened fire, quite possibly accidentally at first, on a crowd of men and boys who were taunting them and harassing them by throwing snowballs, spitting at them, daring them to fire. Eventually they did fire, and eventually 5 people died from the wounds. In the colonies, the incident was dubbed as the Boston Massacre and used to galvanize support against British tyranny. Now notice here the importance of language and naming. The Boston Massacre was probably a pretty messy and confused event, but with the name massacre attached to it, it becomes a story where there are clear bad guys and good guys. In Britain, in contrast, the massacre is simply known as the incident on King Street. So we've taken a massacre in Britain and downgraded it to an incident, or, from the British point of view, taken a tragic incident and upgraded it to a massacre. Think also of how the people who began referring to themselves as patriots referred to their groups as the Sons of Liberty. This is a pretty clear message being sent, just in a sort of brilliant way of describing your group. So in naming sometimes, and the very words that we use to describe events, refer to people and places, you could almost read half the story. So it's a very powerful cultural and political tool. However, in the few years after the massacre, things actually did die down in the colonies, because new leadership in Great Britain decided to repeal the Townshend Acts, only retaining the tax on tea as a kind of symbolic gesture of Parliament's power, and the boycott in the colonies was called off. It is important to keep in mind that at this point, in 1770, the majority of colonists are far from thinking about the colonies breaking away from Britain to form their own country. Indeed, they still thought of themselves as Englishmen or Englishwomen, and built their argument about why they were being treated unfairly on the basis that their rights as English citizens, the freest, most liberty-loving people in the world, were being violated. So when the Townshend Acts were repealed, most colonists were happy to declare victory and hoped to return to business as usual. Another quick note here about the Boston Massacre. In the background is the famous drawing by Paul Revere, a highly inaccurate depiction of what happened. It shows a clear line of soldiers firing into a large crowd, and this is another good example, right, of political rhetoric in image form, right? Visual propaganda and how it can be effective. So anyways, however, Once the Townshend Acts get repealed, we're thinking, all right, let's get back to how things used to be. But it was not meant to be. The British Parliament just couldn't help itself and had to keep passing things that were pissing off the colonists. And in May 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company, a very large company, a monopoly effectively over importing tea to the colonies, because it made their tea drastically cheaper than any other competitor. Now, according to some of the prevailing economic ideas and practices of nation-states at this time, this was considered by many in the Atlantic world as a perfectly legitimate thing for states to do. We have not talked much about, or at all, about mercantilism, the predominant mode of economic thought and theory at the time, partially because, although most people believed it to be true, the development of capitalism was taking place right under their noses. So we've emphasized that instead. But the gist of mercantilism is that there is a discrete amount of wealth in the world, and wealth cannot generate wealth, which is a key tenet of capitalism, that wealth can generate wealth. So nations just need to hoard as much wealth as possible, according to mercantilism. So in Britain's eyes, a primary purpose of its colonies was to act as a huge market, which they could control and maintain for their own benefit, in whatever way they pleased. So it was perfectly legitimate to hand over an entire market and tea to a company which many people in the British Parliament had a lot of connections to. Because although Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which articulated very clearly for the first time the idea of free markets, was just about to be published in 1776, not coincidentally the same year the independence is declared, at the same time there is not an untrammeled concept of free markets, and there's no inherent sense of how outrageous it was for Britain, as embodied by a group of elites in Parliament, to determine who controlled the entire market in a commodity across thousands of miles. However, unfortunately for the British Parliament, many colonials and merchants associated with the Sons of Liberty had developed an interest in the market for tea, which, incidentally, often involved smuggling. So much smuggling going on in the American colonies at this time. So their profits are, in fact, threatened by this new law. Moreover, tea had become, over the last 3 years, the biggest symbol of so-called British oppression, since the only tax not repealed from the Townshend taxes was the tax on tea. So the most spectacular public protest against the Tea Act was, of course, the Boston Tea Party. In December of 1773, members of the Boston Sons of Liberty boarded a ship from the East India Company and dumped all $900,000 worth of tea into the ocean. Kaboom. Now, there are two very interesting things about the Boston Tea Party. First, as a strategy of political protest, it was rooted in the destruction of private property. We've been hearing a lot of commentary about riots and property destruction lately, and much of it condemns such behavior as unproductive. But it's interesting to note that one of our most celebrated founding moments, if you will, made its point almost entirely through property destruction. Moreover, as we saw with the incidents where the homes and the property of tax collectors were destroyed, creating capitulations on their part, whatever the ethics of this property destruction, it certainly was, in the colonial time period, a very effective strategy, at least in the short term. Second, the Sons of Liberties who carried out the Tea Party were dressed up as Native Americans, which suggests all sorts of weird dynamics going on here. For as we will see in the rest of the course, Native people were far from being considered equal citizens of America, and yet at the same time they played this strange role in the American imagination that they used to naturalize or legitimize their more rebellious or rowdy behavior. So this is just a very strange phenomenon, psychologically speaking, and we won't get into too much detail about it, but it also touches on these themes of the noble savage and the savage. I forget what the first one is, barbarous savage, something, right? The bad savage that we talked about at the beginning of the course. In any case, the British Parliament and the British Crown were outraged by the Tea Party, and in retaliation they passed a series of measures known to them as the Coercive Acts, which is not really a very flattering term, even though it's what the British called it, so you could tell that they were pretty pissed and intended to slap the colonists into proper behavior. But to the colonists it was known as the Intolerable Acts. Now these acts included several policies. First, Boston was declared to be in a state of insurrection, and the port of Boston was shut down, closing off all of its shipping activities until Britain decided it was appropriate to reopen it. Second, an act stipulated that colonists had to provide barracks and housing for British troops, the Quartering Act. Now, theoretically, this meant that soldiers could even demand to stay in individual people's houses. Although this rarely happened, patriots made much of this possible threat to the sanctity of a man's home, supposedly his personal domain of liberty. It much more commonly meant, however, that cities and towns would have to provide the funding for housing British troops in their community, whether they wanted to or not. Third, the Justice Act ensured that British soldiers and officers did not have to be tried in the colonies, but rather could wait to be sent back to Britain for trial. Now, in the eyes of the colonists, this would give British soldiers the freedom to get away with basically whatever they liked. And some were especially angry that the act clearly implied that British soldiers and officials could not get a fair trial in the colonies, since the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre, or the incident on King Street, had been defended actually by the important Patriot leader John Adams and acquitted. So they took offense, right, that Britain was clearly implying we have to bring British soldiers and officials back to Britain to try them because the colonists are out of their minds and they will not give them a fair trial. They found that particularly offensive because John Adams, cousin to Samuel Adams, by the way, was a Patriot leader, but had actually defended the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre and had gotten them acquitted. So they said that's absolutely not true. Right here in Boston itself, we had one of our best men stand up and give them a hearty defense, and they were set free. So this was, offensive to the egos of many, especially elite gentlemen. Most disturbing, however, was the Massachusetts Government Act, which revoked the colony's charter, which effectively abolished the self-government of the colony of Massachusetts, and also placed restrictions, even on the practice of local democracy in the form of town meetings in the colony of Massachusetts, throughout Massachusetts. Therefore, the self-governing institutions of Massachusetts were directly attacked, spreading fear to all the colonies that these bodies, which they viewed as the protectors of their English liberties, could be done away with by a simple declaration from Britain. So what do they do about these intolerable acts? Well, first they convene the First Continental Congress, which lasted from September to October in 1774 in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress was a congress of representatives from all over the colonies. Although there was intense debate about how to respond to the intolerable acts, ultimately, the Congress decided to send a declaration to Britain demanding that the acts be repealed and, moreover, asserting that Parliament had no right to interfere in colonial self-government to the extent that it did, and that, moreover, its powers were limited to regulating trade. While all of this is going on, right after this wraps up, right? I thought that was right. Fighting finally breaks out, not surprisingly, in Massachusetts, where so much of the resistance had been concentrated. To make a long story short, the military governor of Massachusetts started to try to seize the armory supplies of Patriot organizations, and when they, in return, organized to defend those reserves, Open battle broke out, first in the town of Lexington and then in the town of Concord, where the troops had been sent to seize a supply of Patriot weaponry. So with open warfare finally occurring, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1775. Yet still, the Congress was hesitant to make a final break with Britain, and sent instead another petition to beg the king to retract the oppressive acts of Parliament and make peace in the colonies. However, the king denied them this, and rather declared them an open rebellion. At this point, opinion moved more swiftly towards independence, bolstered by the development of powerful arguments from many patriots that it had become incredibly clear, or as Thomas Paine put it, common sense, that the preservation of liberty required breaking away from Great Britain and forming an independent nation. Exactly what the content of those ideas were, and what traditions and innovations they relied upon for their logic, is what we will talk about next time.